excited to kind of kick this off here. I'm Suzanne Fletcher. I'm one of the general partners with Prime Movers Lab. I've been an investor for about 20 years, long before sleep was even an investable theme. Excited to welcome our audience today, our limited partners, founders, extended Prime Movers Lab family, and a special welcome to our new Prime Movers Growth limited partners. We're an early stage deep tech fund investing in prime movers, entrepreneurs that we think have the ability to positively impact billions of lives. And what touches more lives than sleep? One of the reasons we're really excited to talk with you about that today. And kind of our 6 broad industry verticals: energy, infrastructure, manufacturing, transportation, agriculture, and longevity. And we do these webinars as an opportunity to bring our community together and to kind of share some of what we've learned as we've explored some of these themes. Housekeeping, we're going to keep this to an hour. Please put questions in the chat and we will weave those in toward the end. I'm extremely excited to be co-hosting this with Amy Cruz. Amy joined us officially last fall as a partner and principal biologist, but she has been known to our firm for many years, having been the CSO of one of our portfolio companies and having spent many years as a program manager at DARPA, where she saw some seriously cool deep tech and did some seriously cool things related to sleep. She's written extensively on this topic for PML. I highly recommend her blog post called Decoding Sleep. I learned some interesting things. 50 to 70 million of us in the US have a sleep disorder. You know, we generally experience less deep sleep as we age, so that's not looking good for any of us, probably on this webinar. And there's a portion of the population, about 1%, with a genetic mutation that causes them to need way less sleep than the rest of us. I hate those people. And of course, Amy chose to underscore some of the no-nos of good sleep. That is, no caffeine, no alcohol close to bed, no cell phone, and no dogs on the bed. And I don't know any of us who are guilty of any of these things, but wonderful to know that we all can be out there improving our sleep hygiene. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Amy, who's just been leading all things involved in the brain for Prime Movers Lab, and sleep being one of those. So over to you, Amy.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Thanks, Suzanne. Really excited to be here today and with our panelists. Want to welcome Dr. Tononi, Dr. Doty, and Dr. Murphy, who are going to talk to us and represent kind of each different parts of sort of the sleep sort of family and continuum and different ways. And so in order to do that, instead of introducing them myself, I'll actually ask them to introduce themselves, give a little bit about their background, and then kind of maybe anchor it in, you know, why they got interested in sleep. And so I'd love to kick that off with my longtime colleague and friend, Dr. Giulio Tononi.
Thank you, Amy. This is Giulio Tononi. I am talking from the University of Wisconsin-Madison, where I am a professor of psychiatry and a neuroscientist. And yes, indeed, I've been interested in sleep for a very, very long time. And I met Amy, I would say, more than 19 years ago or so. And we were interested in a DARPA project at the time whose aim was explicitly to get rid of sleep. So we'll get back to that, I'm sure, pretty soon. But for the moment, let me just say that my interest in sleep started when motivated during medical school to understand what consciousness is. I thought, what other time is there in which regularly we lose and regain consciousness every night? When we dream, we are conscious. When we don't dream, the only time during our life we lose consciousness happily every night from day one to our death. So that was obviously a good reason to study sleep. But of course, I realized right away that it was, and it still is, perhaps the most important biological mystery that remains. We know most other important things. We're trying to understand the technical aspects. We're trying to get more and more sophisticated in treating diseases. But why we sleep, while every animal sleeps, remains a mystery. And so, of course, that motivated me, and still does, in studying what sleep is for, how does it work, and perhaps how can we augment it.
Fantastic. Thank you, Giulio. I'll now hand it to Dr. Keith Murphy.
Thanks, Amy. I'm Keith Murphy. I am the co-founder and head of engineering at Attune Neurosciences, and we're a company creating next generation wearables for brain mapped and targeted alteration of sleep circuits. And I'm also a postdoc currently at Stanford University. So I am actually following in the trail of Giulio. I originally worked on fruit flies, studying how metabolism and sleep were related. And in the last 3 years, I joined the laboratory of Luis de la Sea to use a technique called optogenetics. And that allowed us to look at small sleep circuits in the mouse brain to figure out how we could change these little tiny regions without affecting other parts of the brain. And we've discovered some really interesting things about how to non-invasively modulate these circuits that we're now translating into this company. And that's how I met Amy and Suzanne, and I'm really happy to be here.
Thanks, Keith. TJ, Dr. Doty, I'll turn it over to you for intro.
Sounds great. So they are picking up the trash right now on my street in Baltimore. So if this is too loud, you can cut me off and come back to me. The dangers of working from home. So hi, I'm Tracy Doty, or TJ. I'm the chief of the Sleep Research Center at the Walter Reed Army Institute of Research, or RARE. We are DoD's premier sleep laboratory. We have 8 beds that are only utilized for research. My way that I came to sleep is kind of interesting, and I think it really kind of underscores the importance of sleep as well. So I'm actually a cognitive neuroscientist by training. I did my PhD in a partnership with the NIH and the Karolinska, and I was using fMRI to study how people respond to emotional faces. When I finished up there, I was like, I really want to do something more applied, and I ended up picking up and doing a postdoc with the Army Research Lab. And there we were studying stress in the real world. So we had a lot of wearables. They were streaming to a smartphone in real time. We were very interested in dry EEG technology. And we were getting data on folks in the lab, what was stressing them out. And the one thing I realized is that sleep had the largest impact on their stress levels and also on performance. And I was like, this sleep thing might be really important. And then it just so happened that a job opened up at RARE, which is where I'm at now. I've been there for 6 years. And I've been studying sleep ever since then. And I cannot believe that I have just now only started studying sleep. And I cannot believe that we didn't talk about sleep more in my cognitive neuroscience training. So I'm happy to share more as we sort of move on. And, thanks so much for giving me an opportunity to chat today.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks for sharing that. As you can see, we've got a really nice sort of broad set of perspectives here. And given that we're eventually, in the course of the webinar today, going to talk about sort of augmenting sleep and maybe, some things that we can do to modulate that. It might be really nice to just actually sort of anchor it in maybe talking about why we sleep, or some thoughts around, sort of that in general. And Giulio, I know you have some thoughts that you'd like to share with us around that. So I was going to open the floor to you first to sort of share some thoughts that might help anchor us, and then we can sort of spring from there.
Yes, I'll be happy to say a few words about it, and probably many more later if you allow me to do so. The fundamental question as a doctor, for instance, that you face when seeing somebody who is complaining about his or her sleep, which is very, very common, is what should you recommend? Okay, should you recommend that the person sleeps more, sleeps less, sleeps balanced, sleeps well? You all know this, it's always a problem. But the number one question the doctor would have is, well, what is good sleep and what is good for? Okay. And the answer is not really there yet. There is no agreed upon answer to what sleep is for fundamentally. So basically now we resort to saying, whatever makes you feel good, that's obviously fine. If you don't feel refreshed, you feel that you're not working very well, you think it's sleep's fault, then maybe we can do something about it. And second, of course, you can try to bring the person back to the norm, whatever the norm is, but even that is not well understood. And even there are people who, as we all know, can do quite well with a few hours, and people who don't do well if they don't get 9 hours. Okay, so the spectrum is very, very broad. And if you don't have a fundamental understanding of the essential function of sleep, these recommendations are very much empirical. Okay, so I would just say this for the moment, and let the other people on the panel say what they think about it. But for me personally, it has been a quest about the essential function of sleep that has lasted for several decades now. And really, the way we approached this question was to say, is there some essential function that is a must? Because one important thing to recognize is that every animal species we have studied so far, and now we have studied many, and every year there are several new species that come up. A long time ago, we showed that fruit flies sleep, since Keith mentioned fruit flies, okay? So fruit flies sleep, octopi sleep, everybody, every species has been studied sleeps. And not only do they sleep in the sense of not responding to stimuli, but also if you sleep deprive them like we do in humans, they sleep more. There is no exception. And there is no, that we know of at least. And there is no exception even across the lifespan. We know we sleep more as babies and less later on, but everybody sleeps, okay? And it's very unlikely that something like sleep, where you're disconnected from the world and you're a potential prey, or to say the least, you're not doing the other things you could be doing, from foraging to sex, or of course, business, whatever is your trade, so to speak. If you don't do that, it's a big opportunity cost. So sleep is a fantastic, monstrous, abysmal opportunity cost that if natural selection could have dealt with, otherwise it would, but it hasn't. So there must be a fundamental function. And we have a very precise idea at this point of what that function might be through many years of work. And I'll just say what we think it is, and we can elaborate on that later. We think that sleep is essentially the price we pay for plasticity. During wake, we learn, whether we know it or not, whether we study or not. Just going around, there is no way you're not going to learn a lot about the world, what happened. And very often the problem is knowing what was important, what was not. That's always true in life. And it's also true every day, okay? You acquire a lot of knowledge. It must leave a trace in your brain. And then you can't just accumulate that stuff. You need to get rid of the garbage. And we think sleep does that, not only from a memory perspective, but also from a biological perspective. The cells in the brain learn by strengthening their connections. That is unsustainable. It's really like a company must at some point, reduce whatever is a surplus that's not really helpful. So these are fundamental things. I say one last thing here, which is this. Unlike, say, food, where getting to the essential function of food is sort of easy, you just starve a person completely, the person dies, or an animal dies, and then you figure out, it took a bit to science to figure out exactly why food was essential, though we all knew it was essential. It's because of energy, of course. This is not even worth saying these days, okay? Food, in the end, is because of energy, despite the vagaries of the diet that you prefer to follow. For sleep, you cannot do that. I cannot take any of us, or any animal for that matter, and deprive her of sleep completely, like I starve you of food, because the brain is going to go to sleep no matter what. Some piece independent from some other piece. So it may not be a great sleep, it may be a very dysfunctional sleep, but sleep always wins. Okay, that's something to keep in mind. So we can't just do that experiment. The experiment has been attempted, but you still get 30% of sleep. And what happens to animals and humans at that point is they die, although it's not clear why, after 2, 3, 4 weeks, something like that. In any case, because you can't do that experiment, you can't just isolate the function in a trivial way. This is why a lot of work was needed. But I think it's important to keep in mind, at least for me, if there is a fundamental function, which we suspect would be this, in the end, we call it synaptic down selection, is reducing the garbage in the brain in various ways. And if you have that function, then it makes sense to ask, well, what should we do with sleep? Should we augment it, and how? I'll stop here.
Right. Thank you. Thank you, Giulio. I'm going to open it up to Keith and TJ, if you guys had any sort of follow-on comments to that before we move on to sort of augmenting sleep.
I think the one thing that I'll say is that, as someone who's been newer to the field of sleep, so I'm, it's been 6 years now, a little over 6 years. I've always been amazed at how everyone has a theory of this is what sleep does, and kind of underscoring what Dr. Tononi said. It's such a huge biological cost to sleep, and we all do it. So my idea is that there's no way there can just be one function. There must be, a myriad of functions. And of course, we're finding out that there are. So something to keep in mind as we see theories of, the Shaw hypothesis, the synaptic downscaling, there's removing the garbage from the brain. There's so many things that are going on when you're sleeping, and so many of them are so essential. So I just wanted to make sure and make that point.
Awesome. Thank you.
Yeah, and I'll just jump in to sort of paint a picture, and I like to do this when talking to people outside the field quite a bit. So Giulio mentioned sort of cleaning up the overconnected brain, which he himself pioneered, and I think that's a super important aspect that we all respect. And one of the newer things that I really like that's been coming about in sleep, really in the last like 5 years, it's been getting a lot of experimental traction, is that when we're awake and the energy is, the brain is consuming energy, and a lot of energy, like 20% of the entire body's energy is burned by the brain. It's also creating all of this trash, all of these little molecules that just kind of sit around all of these neurons. And when they accumulate too much, you know, we may all agree that that might be one of the things that kills us or messes with how well the brain functions. And there was always this thinking that, you know, maybe during sleep, the removal of these particles is actually quicker. And indeed, you know, very literally over the last 5 years, the Nettergaard group over at UMass showed with radio label tracing that these fluid pockets, often called ventricles, so actually fluid would open up very large during non-REM or non-rapid eye movement sleep. And this water would just sort of rinse into the brain, the particles would dissolve in and then be carried out. They never showed that the particles were actually in the fluid, but the fact that the fluid pockets were larger during sleep was really fascinating to me. And then there was I guess you could call it a follow-up study even within the last year. So when I'm saying these things, they're really cutting edge. We're just learning this as we go. But they showed that the slow waves in the brain, which we can talk about later, and these are the oscillations that occur at like 1 hertz. So much too slow to really encode information, but clearly doing something functional because they happen very large during these deeper phases of sleep. So they showed that when the brain had these large, slow oscillations, you know, that we didn't normally think were functional, there would be a rush of blood, and then immediately subsequent to the blood, this large flow of fluid. Now, normally, even while you're awake, you get these little pulses of fluid everywhere in the brain. But when you get these really large pulses, you know, I believe, and the authors of this paper, maybe the other panelists, Amy and Suzanne, we can all disagree, I'm not sure. I believe that these large fluid rinses are critical to all of, you know, many of sleep's really beneficial functions. And that if we can work on improving these slow waves and this rinse, you know, we can get a lot of benefit from that. And I'll just stop there, going on a rant here.
Interesting. Thank you. Thanks for sharing that. Obviously a lot, you know, as we know, as we've just discussed, there's no, you know, sort of definitive answer about what sleep is for, but we've heard some sort of theories about, you know, sleep's function, sort of given some of those potential, you know, sort of functions of sleep. If we were going to augment sleep, what might be some of the most, you know, sort of beneficial elements to do is enhancing these slow waves. The most, you know, most important thing to do is, you know, is shortening sleep the most important thing to do? I'm curious, you know, what the panel thinks about if you had one thing that you could augment around sleep, what it might be.
If I may, Amy, before going there, I want to just add on a couple of comments to what both Tracy and Keith said.
Absolutely.
So Keith referred to this idea that during sleep, especially we think during the slow waves that he mentioned, there is going to be some clearance of waste products in the brain, which is the idea of Mike and Nettergaard. And literally, we are collaborating with her in testing this idea right now. It's a very powerful idea, and it's very important with respect to the possible consequences in terms of accumulation of these substances in the brain that might lead to, you know, increased probability of neurodegenerative disorders. It's all very open, but it's a very important idea. In a sense, sleep would be for clearing the brain not only of excessive synaptic strength, but also of these accumulated molecules, just as you said, and it is being actively investigated. And there is no doubt, I completely agree with Tracy there, that sleep being so fundamental and present in every species all the time and taking up a third of our life, so to speak, it is now burdened with lots of other functions that will happen better during sleep than at other times. So if, you know, you have every animal is sleeping at least a third of the time or so, then evolution will make sure that various things that happen better in sleep go on there. From a practical perspective, this is why this, I think, leads up to the next aspect of the conversation. It's still important, though, and to distinguish between a core or essential function, the one that would explain why there is sleep in every species, that has not been somehow avoided by evolution. It has not been able to find an alternative solution. If it were just a matter of getting rid of more waste products, there are other ways to do it in principle. Okay, but there are some things, and I think that it is the down selection of synapses, which is the essence of learning. Okay, you cannot live without learning, I'm sorry to say so, and therefore you need sleep. So that is unavoidable, and that, I think, why sleep is universal. On top of that, many other functions have, I think, accrued, and I think from a practical point of view, whereas we might actually not worry too much about certain functions, there are others that are important for our everyday well-being and have important cognitive consequences that we can try to enhance. But we shouldn't lose track, in my mind, of what is probably the essential function that carries all the others with it. I'll stop there again, and I'll be happy to hear what everybody has to say about how to augment it.
Yeah.
A long history there.
Yes, there is a long history there. Keith or Tracy, what do you think? I mean, if down selection and plasticity, if it's the price we pay for plasticity, say that 3 times fast. Is that worth enhancing or augmenting? What are your thoughts?
So I guess this would have to be a question that almost circles back to Giulio's points. But I think slow waves, and I kind of set myself up to say I really like slow waves. There are other things in sleep that are useful, the duration, sleep spindles, things like this. But let's go to slow waves for a second here, because I think they're really great. Of course, slow waves potentially may aid in these fluid openings, and I think we all agree that that may be an important part of things, very likely. But I'm pretty sure that with this whole wire together, fire together hypothesis, that slow waves also play a role in some of this synaptic downscaling. So, slow waves as a target is really important. There are tons of people that have recognized this, including TJ and others, working in the fields, that if somehow we can enhance these, we can get to one of the core functions of sleep. I think it's also really important to think about how to help people initiate sleep in general. Just what is it that is keeping us awake before we enter the sleep state, and also what wakes us up. How do we blind internal and external sensory systems? Probably a lot of especially American sleep is really poor because we're noticing the iPhone next to our bed or the noises outside or just whatever it is. If we can somehow manipulate this. And we can't ask people to just get rid of stuff, right? We can't just say, hey, stop using your phone and eat a better diet. Like, they're just not doing it. But if we can manipulate the core regions of the brain that actually gate sensory function, I think that could be another good aspect of sleep to work on. If you let me go back to slow waves, I'd go forever. So I'll just say slow waves and sensory gating, and those kind of play into initiation and maintenance of sleep. Those are my favorites. TJ, how about you?
Yeah, TJ, tell us what you guys are looking at.
I mean, I'm team slow wave too. We study slow waves, and the reason we do is because they're prioritized by the brain. So as you go through your sleep cycles, slow wave sleep is prioritized. But getting into slow wave sleep, and this goes to something that Keith said that I think is really important, that's a really complete slowing of the brain. It takes a while to get to that place. Can you get people there a little bit faster? Could that potentially mean that you optimize your sleep? If you could get to that deeper restorative sleep faster, and could you potentially stay there longer? Could you make it so that you don't need to sleep as long? I don't know. One of the things I really want to caution is that we just don't completely understand if you add something to the system or you take something away, how is it going to balance? And, in our group, we study interventions, and we're using brain stimulation, electrical stimulation to enhance slow wave sleep. Transcranial electrical stimulation. And we see some really nice benefits if you do it over a 2-hour shortened sleep opportunity. But, what is that like in the real world? Could you do it every night? I'd be interested to hear what the other panelists think, but I have a distinct feeling that the brain is just going to be like, oh, you're giving me this, well, I'm going to do this other thing. And eventually it's going to see sort of homeostatically, I like to say homeostatically eaten. At some point, the homeostasis will come back into play. But I do think that the key here is the slow waves. I'm really definitely team slow wave. I could also talk about them at length with Keith. So maybe I'll stop there so that we don't end up talking just about slow waves.
That's very interesting that, you know, that you're looking at augmenting sleep with the stimulation in short sleep bouts. I think that's a fascinating space if you think about shift work, right? Or if you think about folks in the military who have, you know, kind of reduced sleep opportunities, you're definitely trying to get them, you know, an enhanced opportunity, right? In the context of a situation where you know they're not going to get a full night's sleep, right? So I think that's a very, very interesting goal. I'm curious to pull on a little bit of a thread that came up in terms of, we've talked about the sleep itself, but I'm really curious about sleep onset since Keith, you sort of mentioned that sleep onset, you know, something I used to have trouble with when I was younger, sleep onset. Now that I'm older and maybe more tired and on Zoom too much, I seem to fall asleep better than I did when I was younger, but I don't really necessarily have control over that. You know, why is it the case that we just don't, you know, we haven't dialed in on that yet? There's been some crappy pharmaceuticals like Ambien and other stuff that are out there, but it's not really that effective for increasing sleep quality. Anybody have any thoughts on that?
So, Amy, is the question around pharmaceuticals not working well, or is it more about why we can't initiate sleep?
I think it's maybe a dual question, right? Because sleep onset is something that pharmaceuticals certainly target and maybe reduce overall sleep quality as a result of that, but yet we don't really have a lot of technologies or tools in our toolbox right now to help people fall asleep faster or you know, even just cause sleep onset other than obviously putting someone unconscious. So I was just curious if there were any thoughts there.
I'll talk about pharmaceuticals just a little bit. I mean, certainly a lot of sleep drugs do work, at least initially, to shorten latency to sleep, right? I mean, we've all taken some like really, you know, crazy benzodiazepine or something that just knocks us out. The problem is that the habituation, you know, internal in our brain to these substances is very quick and it's very dramatic. I won't get too deep into the mechanism, but most pharmacology is through something called Gpcr binding. These are these little proteins in our brain that latch onto the molecule and signal to the cell to do something. And these are particularly interesting because when they're triggered, after the molecule is bound and released, they'll actually internalize back into the cell. So they're no longer available to signal. So, you know, much like the problem of a drug addict, the more you take these sleep pharmaceuticals, they don't work as good, and you get dependency issues and that sort of thing. There's also this, you know, huge side effect profile. Your memory may be really bad. You may be drowsy for days. All these things people really hate. So I wouldn't say they don't work for initiating sleep, but they're not things that people like. And that's why there's this huge sort of kickback on sleep pharmaceuticals in general. And that's why I personally hate them. The other bit is really around, you know, in this day and age, why we can't initiate sleep as well. I think we're getting further and further away from natural circadian variation. So of course, blue light, like we shouldn't be exposed to it after the sun goes down. It needs to be shut off hours before, because these little light sensitive molecules deep in our brain, you know, they're really, really sensitive to blue light. Amy, I know you're super familiar with this, this type of thing. So people don't realize that. They're catching on with these blue light filtering glasses. That's great. But there are other things like temperature, social interaction, physical exercise. They're all done at the wrong time. Like we're in this really weird futuristic state, and, you know, we're not trying to fix it. So we have to come up with new futuristic solutions. And I'll stop there and go to the other panelists.
Yeah, I'll be happy to say something to that because I believe that is one of the most promising but underdeveloped area for enhancement, meaning the falling asleep. So first, a couple of historical remarks. Okay, we all know that inducing sleep is an active process, really, if you want to do it effectively. And we all know a way to do that, and that's alcohol. So even before you go to drugs, alcohol as a drug is something that we all know can put you to sleep if you just go with high enough intake of alcohol. As everybody knows, and as every doctor recommends to patients, it is not something that maintains sleep nicely, apart from all the other side effects. And you're going to actually wake up earlier. It's going to be bad for your sleep in general. But it does do what it needs to do, putting you to sleep. And so do, of course, the hypnotics, and so do anesthetics, even better. That's the only thing that almost always works. Okay. Now, passively, this is exactly the problem that Keith mentioned. Falling asleep passively is more and more difficult these days because of all these interfering factors that make it much less natural to just get tired in the evening and go down with the sunset. Okay. On the other hand, exactly almost 100 years ago, there was one of the first set of studies with electrical stimulation deep in the brain, in which it was demonstrated that you could sort of entrain sleep, make a cat go to sleep by stimulating the brain in a certain way. And now this is a very, very old experiment, as you can imagine, 100 years old. It's just trivial electrical stimulation inside the brain. But so far, nobody that I know has been able to replicate something like that, that is, be able to entrain some rhythm in the brain from the outside, not going inside, okay, non-invasively, and of course with a device, not with a drug, such that you might produce a similar effect. This would be immensely popular and powerful. And I think we have many of the tools and now the recording apparatus to develop this in a systematic manner. Okay, so I'll take this opportunity actually for the listeners to add something to what Tracy and Keith said about slow waves, that they love them and they sort of want to work with them and they are the most important phenomenon. I agree, although we shouldn't lose track that there is non-REM sleep or REM sleep. The sequence is important. There are sleep spindles. I think we all agree on that. It's just a reminder for the public. But what are slow waves? Which is really what occurs when you have finally properly falling asleep. You've got slow waves all over your brain, okay, early in the night, at least in adults. What happens is that throughout the cerebral cortex and elsewhere, and in the cerebral cortex, there are roughly 16 billion neurons. These neurons go literally down into what is called a down state, in which they stop firing, almost all of them. They actually hyperpolarize, meaning the membrane potential goes down, let's say 15 millivolts, which is a lot for a neuron. They stay down for a fraction of a second, and then they jump back up 15 millivolts and start firing. So that overall, they don't fire much less than when you're awake. But the defining feature of non-REM sleep, which is the bulk of sleep, 80% or so, is that you've got either all the neurons, so to speak, in your cortex, especially early on in the night, and then subsets of them that go offline for a fraction of a second and do it again. And they do it roughly once, twice a second, or every 2 seconds. So on average, at the end of the night, you've done it thousands of times. Your neurons have done that. So that's what's happening. These guys go off and on and off and on once a second or so. And we all think that that is somewhat important. Now, the sleep enhancement, which we have been pursuing, all of us here, is mostly aimed at increasing the effectiveness of these slow waves, synchronizing them more, making them more frequent, which is presumably good because we think they mediate many of the functions of sleep. But how do you actually entrain the brain before you fall asleep to enter a rhythm like that? And it's clear that it has something to do with the bath of neuromodulators that is sort of flooding the brain when you're awake, and it changes, we know this very well, when you fall asleep. That's what we're fighting against. When we want to fall asleep, we're trying to induce these slow waves, but we're fighting against the sea of neuromodulators, this broth that's all over, that is trying to keep the neurons up and not down, okay? So we are trying to do that. And all I'm saying is that I think for the future, this is really an area where we must actually use, I think, neurophysiological knowledge that we have accumulated and biochemical knowledge we have accumulated in order to devise a scenario where we can meaningfully and in a scientifically driven manner enhance the falling asleep process. I think you're completely right. I mean, that is a key area for development.
That's excellent. Thank you.
And I think another thing I imagine this group can all agree on is that children are not good for sleep. Definitely not pro sleep at all in terms of keeping you asleep, inciting sleep. But I love how technical this group is. And for our audience, curious if we can kind of break down some shared language in terms of the different types of sleep technologies. And as we think about investable themes as well. So, I mean, as Amy's kind of helped me come up to speed here and talking about wearables, both kind of wrist and finger versus head worn, and then open loop versus closed loop, and what form factors those take. I wonder if folks on this panel can help educate our audience a little bit here on the different form factors these can take and why some might be more interesting than others.
Okay, just one thing here, very quickly. Based on what I said before, I think we should first and foremost distinguish between sleep-inducing devices or tricks and sleep-enhancing devices or tricks. These are really two very different goals. The sleep-inducing are not really there. I mean, that on the market, there is a gigantic amount of things. Usually, it's just sounds and tricks like that in order to facilitate the falling asleep. But those are really low-tech solutions. I mean, there's nothing there that's really based on something powerful that we know about the brain. Sleep enhancement is once you are asleep, can we make that sleep more effective so that over maybe a restricted period of sleep because you cannot afford it, because you're sleep restricted because of work and so on and so forth, or because of the disease, can we make those 4 hours more restorative than they normally would be? Okay, like potentiate, that's the idea of the power sleep or power nap. Just a basic comment. Sleep inducing, sleep enhancing devices. Somebody should say something about closed loop, open loop, TMS, TDCS, and so on, not me.
I guess maybe I'll just jump in here on those. So what I will say, based upon something that's wearable, like that you have on your wrist or your finger, or something that's head worn, you know, the only reason to go to head worn is if you want to do some sleep staging, if you want to really look at the signals in the brain. Because from everything that I have, from working with companies that have head worn technology, people do not like to wear things on their head while they're sleeping. They would far prefer to just put on a Fitbit or something that they wear on their wrist. And you certainly don't want something that's going to interfere with sleep. So I think when we talk about, wrist, finger versus something that you have on your head, really the only advantage here for what you're wearing on the head is that you'll be able to get electrical signals. Or maybe if you really want to, put in some sound somewhere, I could also see that. But I think that, this idea of induction versus enhancement of sleep is really important, because if you wear something to help you induce sleep, you could just wear it for a little bit and then take it off. If it's something that you need to have on the entire night, I mean, that's definitely something a little bit different. It's a consideration.
Yeah, and Keith, maybe you can say a couple things about sort of open loop versus closed loop, and what we sort of mean by that, right?
Sure, and it's good that you all bring this up, because I know those terms are thrown around like crazy and we don't always know. So open loop, and Giulio and TJ have worked a lot with both sides of the technology, and myself as well. Open loop is when you have a subject, you have your device, and you don't care what the subject is doing, you just have some sort of thing that you're going to do. So this might be, and we'll just take an example from what we're talking about. This might be like wearing a little electrical device where there's little electrodes around your scalp, and you know that you are going to deliver 15 hertz little electrical pulses, and you're going to try to induce spindles, for example. You don't listen to the patient, you don't care if they're asleep, you don't care if they're awake, you just do it. That's open loop. Your intervention just goes open, it goes astray. Maybe that's a good way to think of it. Closed loop is where you have your intervention, and on the other end of this loop, you are listening to feedback from the actual user. So I'm going to contort the example I just gave and say, I am ready to deliver 15 hertz, but only when the other end of this loop tells me that this patient is in non-REM type 2 sleep. So the device is now listening to this electrical activity of the brain. And as soon as it sees that the patient is asleep, it will then loop back around and trigger this 15 hertz stimulation. Now you can get really complex or simple loops, but closed versus open really just means, am I responding or am I just doing? And I think, I don't know if that's a good way to explain it.
Right, right. No, that's a really good you know, sort of thing. The other thing in open loop is you could just record data, right? So another thing is just having an output from someone, you know, whether it's from the wrist or the ring or whatever else, right? I wear my Oura ring, but the loop isn't closed, right? Like I'm the one who has to close the loop, right? If I want to modify my behavior, right, there's nothing about those devices, sort of passive devices, right, that are causing us to sort of do anything other than potentially change our behavior, right? You know, there's a couple of questions around audio stimulation. We've talked about electrical stimulation. Somebody asked a question about binaural beats. Do we really know that, you know, if I'm wearing like a headband and it's measuring my sleep state, that if I put audio information, you know, into my brain, does that actually impact sort of sleep quality?
So I'll take that because you know, we have literally played around with all kinds of stimulation modalities to enhance slow waves, which in this audience certainly is a good thing to try and do. Of course, based on the notion that slow waves carry, for instance, this key function of sleep, synaptic downsolation, and possibly also the clearing of, you know, these metabolites. So they, you know, both are potentially very interesting. So why not try to enhance them? And we played around with everything. We have the, you know, perhaps 15 years of work in which we tried olfactory stimuli, like puffing air into your nose, perfumed or not, perfumed in different ways, touching your skin, vibrating the bed, which is sort of, some people are doing that like a crib also, okay? Then with little electrical stimuli to your wrist, and then flashes of light, even though your eyes are closed, you name it, okay? And then, of course, also acoustic stimuli, in which we tried everything from Beethoven, but Beethoven at 1 hertz, okay? It's a very, very strange way of doing that, to pure tones, varying the tone so the brainstem does not habituate, all kind of things. The one that works best, by far, in our hands, is transcranial magnetic stimulation. And by best, I mean every time we give a TMS pulse, which is a brief injection of current through a magnetic field in the brain, you trigger a gigantic slow wave, and you trigger it basically every time if you do it closed loop in particular, okay? But in any case, you do that wonderfully well. But this is completely out of the question as a practical solution. You're not going to go to bed with a TMS machine, okay? Nobody would do that. And it's also possibly not safe to do it over a long period of time. Electrical stimulation is one possibility, as Tracy was saying. Acoustic, in my mind, remains the best, and in practice, it remains the best for 2 main reasons. One is because it's rather unobtrusive. In the end, you know, you can put a speaker or you can put an earphone wherever you want. A speaker is certainly totally unobtrusive. And 2, because it really mimics a physiological process. So, you know, we humans especially are sensitive to acoustic stimuli during sleep because probably was a key warning signal. You know, if they touch you, it's too late. If you hear it from a distance, it's probably still safe to do something about it, okay? So we have a fantastically well-tuned system, and it's a system which is the whole art of this approach of enhancing sleep, which on one hand wants to protect sleep. So you want to be able to be sensitive to the acoustic stimuli that happen all the time, not, you know, mention sleeping next to an airplane, airport or so. And you don't want sleep to be disrupted all the time. You know, on the other end, you actually want to be able to be awakened if there is something potentially intriguing. So the trick that works best, you know, in our hands was that of varying the stimuli all the time, so that it's always a little bit new for the brain, but not too much, and activating certain neuromodulators just enough that they trigger the slow wave without waking you up. And it's really a razor edge. You have to have that's why you need a closed loop device, okay? You
Uh-huh.
have to be just there where you're enhancing these slow waves, but you don't wake the person up. And you have to do it repeatedly. So that's, I think, what all these devices are trying to do. I'll say this, in terms of investing, in my mind, at the moment, all the headbands, etc., that are around are still not comfortable enough. And I agree with Tracy again, they are not, compliant. You want something that you can put on, or not even noticing in a way that you have it on, every night without even thinking about it. And I think this is doable, but has not yet been achieved. Then you can do a proper closed loop. You can actually make sure you don't wake up the person, interrupt sleep, or do anything untoward. And vice versa, you can enhance sleep, but we have to be realistic. You may want to do, the best you can do is 15-20% increase in the amount of these slow waves during the night. But keep in mind that if you stay awake for a whole day and then you sleep, you have a similar increase in slow waves. So that's a natural response to sleep deprivation. So that's the boosting that we might hope to get. So in terms of sleep enhancement, I think still acoustic stimulation is the best. It has to be done in a smart way. It has to be done very close loop. Ideally, you monitor exactly what's going on, but you want to do it in a way that you wear it every night. Absolutely like that. And we're not there.
Yeah. Is that, opening up, sort of playing off that for a second, maybe that's why, we've certainly seen a profusion of new, sort of sleep headset companies out there, right? I mean, you can definitely go online, right, and purchase one, but it doesn't really seem like they're sort of catching on and very satisfying. And so maybe it's a combination of a comfort aspect and then maybe them being tuned properly to sort of give the right kind of the right impact or effect, right? Because if something had like a really wowza sort of effect, my guess is it would catch on. Of course, if it's not comfortable, then you're not going to sleep anyway. So I was just curious what maybe Keith and sort of TJ, you've probably tried a lot of different of the headbands, is that your perspective, or what is the perspective? Why are there a proliferation and yet I'm still not wearing one every night? So
Yeah, these are all really good questions. I think right now the technology is just not there. It's both things. It's not only are we not really ready in the comfort market for something that you can wear all night. We still have the design down yet. But the other thing is that the efficacy is not there. It's getting there. But you also have a lot of things that are being marketed that don't have a lot of science to back them up. And that's also very frustrating for those of us who do a lot of science right now. I do want to step back though and mention that, we have to be very careful about what the impact of these things are in the long run. I talked a little bit about the homeostatic nature of the brain. Could you wear something like this every single night? Would you want to wear something, or is it something that you use only in certain scenarios where you really need a little bit of a boost? And we don't have the answers to those things yet. I will say in the work that we do for the Army, we always have a big focus on recovery because we think recovery is really important. Unfortunately, recovery is kind of left out of a lot of sleep research. People are just like, oh, I saw an effect, cool, let's move on. We do focus pretty heavily on recovery. And, we have some nice preliminary evidence that some of this electrical stimulation for enhancing slow waves can potentially also boost recovery, which is very nice to know. But I think there's just a lot of open questions. We're much further away than we were before, but we still have a ways to go, which I know is not super satisfying.
Right. And when you say recovery, TJ, just to pull on that, do you mean like physical recovery? Do you mean cognitive recovery? What do you mean about recovery in the context of defense work?
Yeah, so kind of opening up the defense work, we focus primarily on sleep loss. We do sleep deprivation, where we just don't let people sleep, and we have up to 62 hours that we've done in the lab since I've been there,
Wow.
where they're awake the entire time. We also look at chronic sleep restriction, which is a little bit of a different animal, which is more like what we encounter in our daily lives. If you sleep less than 7 hours a night, you're carrying a sleep debt, so to speak. So we're very interested in, if we give you a certain amount of sleep loss,
Tracy, we lost your sound.
Yeah, TJ, your audio went out for us for a moment, but I'm pretty sure you were going to say you can't just store up sleep and then use it later, which is unfortunate.
Try again.
And while she kind of reconnects on audio, want to make sure our audience knows, feel free to use the Q&A feature if you've got some questions here for the panelists, and Amy and I will get those out there.
Yeah, for sure. Thank you.
I'll actually jump on Ken's question really quick since we missed it. But binaural beats, Ken, they're really interesting in their physics and how you're passing two different frequencies and getting the difference between them. The only thing I've ever seen is that they don't alter basically brain activity when it's actually recorded. So I would just say no, I don't think those work. When people are doing auditory slow wave enhancement, they use something called pink noise, which is basically 1/F. It kind of sounds like, so that would be fine if you weren't sleeping, but unfortunately there isn't some beautiful music that helps you sleep that I know of.
Yeah,
Yes.
especially since Giulio tried Beethoven at one.
We tried everything, everything is too much. But let me just comment on the fact in this talk, okay, that indeed, as we heard, there is a lot, as everybody knows, out there, which has no scientific validity whatsoever, which has not been, evaluated properly. Forget about the functional sleep, not just the effect. Is there an effect? How did they control for it, etc.? Most of what you find out there is absolutely ungrounded. Okay, so that is the number one thing to say. And in the end, for a product to succeed, just as Amy said, it must be doing something that we know it's doing, and hopefully something that is noticeable. Now, that's one of the big problems with sleep, especially this brings us back to the function. Okay, like diet. Okay, there are so many things out there that they are doing great things. You, in terms of the diet, you eat this or you eat that, it's going to be better for you in every damn sense. Okay, most of it is not supported by any evidence, or if it is supported by evidence, it's very contradictory, as we very well know. Okay, so that fashions change. But with diet, at least, you can check the results rather easily. You may like it or not, and you may like the consequence on your weight, say. With sleep, if we are correct in what we interpret to be this fundamental function, apart from feeling more or less refreshed, you are not going to see obvious results every day, okay? You are not going to. It's going to be, I think, a cumulative effect on what you learn and what you remember that shows up only after long periods of time. So what I think will be critical is to have some system that you can put on your head, so to speak, that does a proper enhancement of slow waves and possibly also spindles, plus other things, leave that aside, and then wear this literally for months, okay, 2 months, 3 months, something like that, which means it must not hinder you in any way, must be totally harmless, okay, unnoticeable. And then we may have a large population study in which we see what it's doing on the big numbers. I've done so many studies in the lab where you do things properly with 256 channel EEG. You study subjects very well. For sleep, we really need big numbers, huge number of people under naturalistic condition wearing something that they are happy to wear every night. And then we will see this cumulative effect. I think this is what the future really brings up, okay? It will bring up this, and that's where we will find progress and also, I think, commercial success.
Makes sense. TJ, did we get you back?
Yeah, sorry about that. I was on my government computer and I thought if I got off a VPN, but it just does not like Zoom. So I'm on my phone now. Okay, I'm sorry, I don't know what we missed.
I think maybe if you just, could just say a couple more words about, I had asked you about recovery, and kind of what you were going for there. And then maybe just in the context of, how the things that you've tried, if you could just say, a minute on that again, would be great.
Yeah, I don't know. Did I come through when I was talking about the PT, or was that when I got cut off?
No, that's when you got cut off. Yep.
Okay, great. So I'll jump in for that because I think it kind of putting into context what we look at it in our labs. We use the PVT, the psychomotor vigilance test. It's a very quick reaction time test. You just tap the screen when a counter comes up. This is incredibly sensitive to sleep loss. I noticed that there was a question in the chat about sort of being able to kind of measure where someone is and where they're going. And we use the PVT. The PVT may or may not always, tap into functions that happen that are more complex. However, I do think it is the gateway to cognition. It also maps on quite nicely to impairment with alcohol consumption. And so you can have a really nice level where you say, hey, your PVT's here. It's basically like you're performing as if you were legally drunk. And I think that's a great way, because it's very hard to classify these things. And so when we look at recovery, we're very interested to see, can you get back to your baseline level? So how much sleep do you need following an intervention in sleep loss to be able to get back to baseline levels? And what we're finding is preliminarily that, electrical stimulation to enhance slow wave sleep in a short sleep opportunity seems to help you get back up to that baseline level based upon this PVT metric that we use.
Thank you. That's very useful, because I think that ties that back to what Giulio was saying about, sort of some of these effects are going to be maybe longer term performance effects, right? So if we look at our, sleep score from last night and it was good or it was bad or it was whatever, it's really about how that anchors into performance, and not just sort of feeling refreshed, but right, our actual performance, and then how that integrates over time as we've either recovered from sleep debt or accumulated sleep debt. I think there's a really interesting piece here about sort of like sleep over time. The other thing I just wanted to give a teaser for, and there's certainly not time to cover it today, but obviously sleep and consciousness are very related, and Giulio has done quite a bit of work in the consciousness realm. So maybe we should, springboard from our sleep discussion and do a webinar or a conversation at some point around consciousness. But as he mentioned, it's something that we sort of voluntarily or involuntarily go into an unconscious state every night. And I think that's something in neuroscience that's been a really fascinating topic. So just wanted to, sort of teaser that. And then with our last couple minutes, somebody's posted in the chat here, maybe we could do a round robin with each of you on what are your top 3 recommendations for improved sleep. So if someone had 3 things that they could do, what would those 3 things be? So let's go around. Keith, you're first.
Sure. So mine are mostly experiential based and a little bit of from the literature. Of course, I'm more interested in what we will be able to do someday, but if we're just talking about right now, keep your caffeine intake to the morning. People don't realize how long the half-life of caffeine in your body is. And if you drink it, even at like 1 in the afternoon, it's really going to press well into the night. And caffeine is a very active substance. So keep that to the morning. The other thing is temperature. I don't particularly like these sleep devices that, tell you what your sleep is doing, because there's no study that shows that they're actually helping people. But what you can do is to use the data from that to do your own personal experiments. And when I say experiments, temperature plays a huge role in sleep that people often underestimate. So pick a sheet or a blanket that you're going to use every night, use the same bed, try to keep other conditions very consistent, and change the temperature in your home. Just bring it up or down a degree every night. Look at your data from whatever device you have and see where your best core temperature is. It's not going to be the same for everybody, but I think that can help quite a bit. The last one is make sure you exercise throughout the day. Metabolic expenditure and creation of these bad molecules that we talked about earlier, these are the signaling molecules for sleep. If you don't get these molecules, your body is going to say, I don't need this. Why are you making me do it? Because as Giulio mentioned, sleep is traditionally in the history of evolution of humans, a very dangerous thing that we're trying to avoid. So those are my 3, and I'll stop there.
Right. Thanks. Well, we're right at time, but I think I would say if anybody else had anything else, obviously blue light we talked about. Giulio or TJ, do you have a last word on anything to do to improve sleep?
TJ, if you have nothing to say, given that we have no more time, my big advice as a psychiatrist would be don't worry about it.
Yep.
Because that's going to keep you awake. Okay. And that's one of the most important things.
That was actually mine too.
And many of these devices force us to worry too much about it. How much did I sleep? It becomes another obsession. Okay. Just like all those wrist devices. Anyhow, don't worry about it. And thank you, Emmy.
All right.
Yeah.
Thank you all.
Thank you,
Thanks to the panelists for joining us, and thanks for all the folks who dialed in. We'll have a copy of the webinar for you if you want to share it with anybody. And thank you so much for your time today. And thanks to Suzanne and
Wishing
Brad.
everyone a good night's sleep.
Yeah. All right. Yes, we wish everybody a good night's sleep. All right. Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.
Thank
Bye.
you.